Hi, Monk listeners. Ricki Gurwitz here. I'm sitting in for Rudyard Griffiths. And today's episode, we are featuring two very thoughtful and informed guests with vastly different perspectives on politics and culture. We are joined by Kim Strassel. She's a columnist with the Wall Street Journal. And a familiar voice here at the Monk Debates, Jeff Weaver, who was the campaign manager for Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign. He was an advisor on his 2020 campaign. He has a long history as a Democratic strategist, a Democratic Party strategist. And we're so fortunate to have you both with us today. Welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
So when I first reached out to Jeff to tell him that, we're having Kim on the program, would he join us? I said it would be so nice to have different people with different perspectives. And he said, different perspectives? We're in different universes. And so
this is true.
So today we're going to try and bridge some of that universe gap. And I want to start with Mahmoud Khalil, because this is a story that's raised so many questions about free speech and the government's authority to deport someone based on their, what some argue is thought crime, what others say is a clear, will to overturn, a clear will to undermine Western civilization and democracy. So, Jeff, I'm going to come to you first. Where do you stand on the ICE detention of Mahmoud Khalil?
All right. So in truth in advertising, I got my start in politics as a young activist in the mid-'80s, an anti-apartheid activist at Boston University. I was expelled from Boston University for civil disobedience. So I am somewhat have strong feelings about college protests and the right of students to express themselves on college campuses. And I think it is crazy. I mean, we've heard from the right for a long time about how there's a suppression of thought, of right-wing thought on college campuses. But now we see the Trump administration coming in, and when there's thoughts that they don't like, they're happy to not only suppress those thoughts, but throw people out of the country. So I think it's, whether you agree with him or not, and I'm not telling you I agree with everything he has to say, or everything he's done, or every flyer he's handed out. Apparently there's been some controversial flyers I certainly would not condone. There's no reason to throw somebody out. We need a free exchange of ideas in this country. And folks who are here, particularly people with green cards and students, they should have a right to express themselves peacefully. And we should not be punishing people for that.
Kim, do you have anything to say to respond to Jeff?
Yeah, and first of all, let me just say that while Jeff and I might be in different universes, I've always loved the fact that they are respectful universes. And it's a real joy to get to sit and exchange ideas here. And also, I'm just so happy that the Monk Debate does these sort of things so that you can have that kind of exchange of ideas. I tend to try to divide this in a different way. Instead of just focusing on speech or is it right or wrong, I like to look at, first of all, is there a legal basis for this? And then secondly, is there a good policy or precedent for doing this? Because just because you can do something doesn't mean it's a good idea. I think on matters of the law, there's very little question here. There is litigation going on, but here's the reality that while aliens in the United States here lawfully, whether you're here on a permanent visa with a green card, whether you're here on a temporary visa, you are entitled to certain free speech and due process protections, but they are not as expansive as what are provided to American citizens. And there's a clear provision in the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act that says the Secretary of State can deem anybody that he wants who is on here on a visa, whether permanent legal status or otherwise, someone that would have adverse consequences to foreign policy and therefore remove them. So I think some of the discussion about the legality of this, look, we're going to go through the court system. But at the end of the day, if they choose to want to remove this guy, and this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, the president's powers are at their greatest when he is acting in the capacity of national security or our borders. I don't think there's any question that Khalil, that they have the authority to remove him. That is different from whether or not this is a good idea. And I'm glad to see that there is due process going on here. I think we need more of the facts to know exactly what he did. I would argue a lot of people would have put in very different categories conservatives on campus who have felt as though they can't even express a view in a classroom without adverse consequences on their grades or their standing at that university, versus somebody who is actively handing out flyers glorifying a terrorist organization, Hamas, calling for direct action and setting up encampments in which Jewish students were not allowed to walk through them, an infringement of their own civil rights. That's a very different category. I would also just throw one last thing in here. I don't think we'd be dealing with any of this, and it wouldn't have gone to the level of the federal government and this kind of high profile a case if Columbia had stepped in and done something about this in the beginning and actually disciplined some of these students, allowed the arrest to go forward, because that's another provision of immigration law is if you are found guilty of a crime, you are at grave risk of losing your visa as well too. And I think simply the history of his actions there might well have led down that road in the first place before we got to the point we are now.
Okay, Jeff. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Let me just say, I do think obviously there was expansive authority on the part of the executive branch in terms of dealing with foreign policy. The law is not quite as open-ended as I think Kim suggests. I believe it's talks about a rational basis for believing that this person's a danger. And so whenever you have that kind of language, it's clear the courts have a role in this to decide, what that means in this particular context. So it's not like they can just throw somebody out whenever they want. That's not what the law says. And there is an opportunity for judicial review, and we're going to have that judicial review. And I do hope that the courts will, there is a somewhat of a precedent case back in the 80s that was done by David Cole, who's everybody knows, a very famous constitutional lawyer involving Palestinian students who the government was trying to throw out of the country for advocating for Palestinian independence. And those students ultimately prevailed. So let's hope that continues, that precedent.
My only point is, I think, look, in order to change this, there have been cases, Jeff is right, where people have argued that that language in that law is too vague, that the Secretary of State has too much authority. And in fact, interestingly, one of the judges who ruled that was the sister of Donald Trump. She was overturned on appeal, and including, I believe, by an appeals court that included Justice Alito at the time. And my point is only that I think if this case were to go up to the Supreme Court, the notion that you would get 5 members of the court who would claim that current statute gives too much authority is very, very minimal, especially given that we have actively used that provision many times in the past. In particular, there was a lot of deportations, you can argue if this was right or wrong, in the 1950s, members of the Communist Party.
So a lot of people will say now that this is very reminiscent of McCarthyism, what you just alluded to, this kind of...
Sure.
Right. So I guess my next question to you, Kim, is: are we setting, regardless of the legality of this and if it actually gets passed, is this setting a very dangerous precedent that the government can now come after people whose views they don't agree with?
Well, look, I think it's only a bad precedent if it's open-ended and you do not know why people are being deported, or the rationale shifts or changes. And by the way, that's a risk with this current government. Donald Trump says there will be more, but there hasn't been more deportations, and he hasn't been very clear on what grounds. Again, I think a lot of people would look at the case of this particular individual, and many Americans, average Americans, on the common sense test, would have a hard time defending him in particular, given his actions. But how far does that go? And that's the worry. Look, we have millions of green card holders in the United States, and to have to get up every day and live in concern that some action you took may be grounds for deportation, I think injects a crazy level of insecurity and uncertainty into that system. So look, if they're going to make their arguments here, and I just hope that some very clear rationales come out of that so that people know what is allowed and what is not allowable.
Yeah, and
Well, I
also,
couldn't agree with that more because otherwise, people are subject also to the vagaries of elections in the sense of, assume you had somebody here who was, against the current Cuban regime, and you had a president that suddenly wanted to change the U.S. policy toward Cuba, and suddenly he starts throwing out all these people who have a different view. We start, emptying out Cubans from Florida, or Cuban Americans from Florida, or Cuban green card holders from Florida because they disagree with U.S. foreign policy. I mean, it's a ridiculous position. So I do
well,
hope that there's some clarity,
Well,
and I do hope
Jeff,
that
what
this
do you
is,
think of this? I've heard this argument that
yeah.
if this person had been a German citizen with a green card, he was a white supremacist, and he was arrested on January 6th of 2020 trying to, uh, in the insurrection. Do you think that the liberal community that is so outraged with the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil would come to their support if it was under this other circumstance?
Well, I have very strong views about January 6th. Frankly, as a former military person and a student of history, Robert E. Lee and the treasonous people in the southern part of the country spent 4 years trying to raise that stars and bars over the Capitol, and those folks on January 6th brought that flag of treason right into the halls of Congress. So I have very strong feelings about January 6th. It was an insurrection. It was America's beer hall push. It was an attempt to overthrow the government. And I do think that the people there, I mean, Trump has pardoned them all, so it's a moot point. But I do think that if one of the great failures of the Biden administration was not to hand out a lot of treason charges and to attempt to prison people for a long, long time. So if a foreign national comes here and attempts, in my view, to help overthrow the United States government, they clearly should be expelled, whether they're right, left, or center.
One thing I just also throw in here too, which I think is important, is you have to step back and ask why that provision is in the law for deportation. And I am not suggesting that Mahmoud Khalil falls into this category, but having elevated this case to where it is now and not taking any action. And again, this is why I think it's unfortunate that Colombia didn't deal with this at a time and in a fashion that would have handled it in a less public and less explosive way. But now, if you do nothing, the reason that provision is in the law is to make very clear to actual legitimate terrorist groups that it's a bad idea to try to send people over here whose only interest, to Jeff's point, is fomenting dissension, fomenting overthrow, essentially working on behalf of the terrorist organization's ambition of bringing down the great Satan. So again, I'm not in any way suggesting that he has a direct affiliation or was sent over to do that. I want to be very clear. But one of the reasons that we have this, and it must occasionally be enforced, is to make clear to terrorist groups overseas that that provision of the law is being monitored, and that this is not a good idea to try to engage in disruption in that way.
Yeah.
I mean, look, the danger here, we have a bad history in the United States of during times of conflict, scapegoating people who we perceive part of the other. And certainly Japanese Americans in the Second World War, Kim talked about communists, or people who knew communists during the Red Scare. We have a very bad history here, and we have to be very cautious about how we proceed.
Yeah, I agree, except for that one thing I still think keeps getting muddied in this debate is the difference between speech and action. And this group was involved in that encampment at Columbia University, which did indeed impede the rights of other students and was an engagement in anti-Semitism.
Well, also, this could backfire on the Trump administration. By that, I mean, they're turning the left are turning him into a martyr. And so instead of actually getting at I think all of us can agree that there is an anti-Israel, anti-American bias in a lot of Ivy League campuses. Instead of actually getting to the root of this, they're turning individuals into martyrs that just help the cause. Would you agree with that?
I would. Go ahead, Jeff.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't know if that's the case, because I think the key words you use there are the left and a martyr for the left. And this is at a moment, and I know we're going to talk about this a little later in the show, where I think a lot of strongly held democratic beliefs have found to have been in disconnect with a lot of average Americans. This is why I was saying the common sense test. We haven't necessarily had a poll out yet. How do people feel about the deportation of Mahmoud Khalil? I'm sure that within the Democratic Party, those feelings run stronger. But if you were to ask independents and conservatives, I would wager that there isn't a lot of people that would be rushing to the defense of someone that, again, was openly belonged to a group that was openly hailing the actions of Hamas on October 7th.
Jeff, did you want to respond at all?
Yeah, look, I don't look at this point. There are a lot of factual questions that I don't think you know the full extent of what he was advocating. But I do want to say this as a general proposition, and I have seen, reported in many news sources instances that clearly all of us would agree were anti-Semitic. But I do want to make this point, which is opposing government policy of the state of Israel is not in and of itself anti-Semitic any more than it is for me to sit here on this interview and criticize Donald Trump, which I will do ceaselessly, and that is not anti-American. So I do want to make clear that folks who set up encampments in support of a two-state solution, or which happens to be U.S. Policy, by the way, or in opposition to the Israeli war in Gaza, does not make those people anti-Semitic.
No, I agree. Although, as we put in an editorial, again, this organization, Columbia University Apartheid Divest, you have a spokesman who has said Zionists don't deserve to live. They have put out a formal statement. We support liberation by any means necessary, including armed resistance. And again, support for Hamas's actions on October 7th. And I think that does put this in a slightly different league.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that the encampments went beyond just criticism of the Israeli government.
Correct. I mean, yes, I agree. Criticize the Israeli government all you want, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Okay, I want to just move on because we could spend the whole episode talking about Mahmoud Khalil, but there are so many other things I want to get to. Kim, you recently wrote a Wall Street Journal article or column, and the title was "Why Democrats Are in the Wilderness." And I thought this would be an interesting, way to get at the problems plaguing the Democratic Party, and also Jeff can offer some of his valuable insight into why that's happening. So why don't you start with why you think the Democrats are flailing?
Sure. I mean, look, often when a party has the kind of defeat that Democrats had in November, and by the way, Republicans have had their fair share of these too, the wise thing to do is to step back and do an autopsy of what went wrong. Whether or not those always translate into actionable items or ones that the party is willing to proceed with is different. But at least take a moment of reflection, have some process where you say, what happened? What we have at the moment is Democrats were beat. They certainly feel that defeat. But yet their only sort of going forward approach right now is we must oppose Donald Trump no matter what. My argument is that you cannot effectively oppose Donald Trump and his worldview unless you have already come up with a compelling worldview of your own. The one that the Democratic Party had and led them up to November was not connecting with American voters, turned off a lot of American voters. Democrats have not taken the time to figure out what they're going to stand for instead. We hear a lot of talk about, well, we're going to reconnect with the working class voters. But, they have claimed to be the working class party all along. And that's clearly not translating, in part because of commitments to issues like DEI and climate change, which again, we're hearing a lot of words about common sense voters these days. They simply cannot go so far as to believe that men should be in women's sports and that you shouldn't be able to drive your internal combustion car anymore because somebody in Washington said so. And those are working class voters' views. And just to add one last point, I would argue that one reason they have not been able to formulate a worldview is that they have, over the past 20 years, slowly picked off almost everyone in their party that might be named a legitimate moderate. We saw the last two get run out of town to the Senate in this last election, mostly because they didn't think that they'd survive, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. who were mercilessly opposed by the progressive left for taking any views that were outside the orthodoxy. That's been what's happened to moderate Democrats. There really are none left with any national standing in the party. And so if you're talking about a new approach and new ideas, it's unclear who you turn to at this point to have that happen.
Jeff, do you want to
Well,
offer?
I can tell you, I can say who you turn to. Look, I'll tell you a problem, and I think Kim and I will probably agree on this point, which I'm about to make. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but there are many, many people in the Democratic Party side in leadership who have zero credibility with working class people in this country. And that is why it is so difficult for the Democratic Party to rebrand itself, because you have the same people out there peddling the new brand who were peddling the old failed brand, and people didn't like the old brand, and they're not confident that these same people are actually offering something new. And in fact, in many cases, they're not offering something new. Look, where we are, we're at a very pivotal moment in American politics, I think. It transcends the normal left-right definitions that we've gone by for so long. Leaders of both parties of the last 40 years have led economies that have seen a decline in standards of living for working class people. People are flailing, looking for an alternative. Center right, center left politics are ultimately failures. And so, the choice now is whether we move the Democratic Party into a more stridently or well-defined economic populist position, while at the same time embracing what the Democratic Party used to be for, which was a sort of social libertarianism, as opposed to the preachy, not only do you have to let me live the way I want to live, you also have to embrace the way I want to live, a position that they've been in over the last 15 or 20 years. We have got to, what one person does in their castle, as long as it doesn't impede on somebody else's what they want to do in their castle, and we'll have to work out where the properties meet, where the people's rights of one person intersects with another person. Those are the lines we have to define. But otherwise, we have to live and let live. We got to get rid of cancel culture. Social media has contributed to this. Everybody's got a judgment about everybody else. And you know what? Frankly, to paraphrase Governor Walz, like, mind your own damn business. That's where we've got to get to. We got to get to, like, you live your life, I'll live mine. I won't judge you. You don't judge me. If there's a conflict between, like a real conflict, then let's work that out on the margins. And then in terms of economics, we need to move in a much more economically populist direction that ensures that everybody has an opportunity to participate in an economy based on shared prosperity.
Let me ask, can I ask you a question, Jeff, on that?
Yes. Sure. Can I just
go ahead.
One second. Because you're talking about economic populism, and Trump has his own brand of economic populism. So where does the kind of the elite Ivy League class, the Wall Street, educated people, where do they live in that world? What party do they ascribe to?
To me,
or does no one want them because they're kryptonite?
What's that?
Or does no one want them because they're political kryptonite?
No, I don't know. Look, I think there's room for everybody, and that's what I'm talking about in terms of everybody's in their social circles, and I think that's fine. Like, people construct your life and live the life you want to live, and if you want to only engage and socialize with other Harvard-educated people and talk about things that people in those circles talk about, God bless you. Do it. Who cares? It's all good. It is all good. And if you want to live in a social circle where you listen to country music and
but Jeff, what I mean by that, my question to you was more, the Democrats have been criticized as becoming the party of the elite. And so if they reposition themselves as the party of the working class, which is kind of what you're advocating for, where do the elite live? Where do they go? And I am by no means trying to advocate on their behalf, but they want to put
Somebody's
their money.
Got you these days, right?
I'm sorry?
Somebody has to these days. They're the stepchildren of politics.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Jeff a question about what he said a few moments ago about you live in your world, I live in mine. We have to tolerate all of this. And I'm hearing Democrats say that. But one thing that's notable to me is that they seem to apply it only to cultural, social issues that are going on right now. So I've seen a lot of Democrats come out of this election and say, okay, we'll stop talking about men and women's sports, transgender issues. That's just one that didn't work for us. But here's the thing, and that's my question I have to you. What you just said sounds great to me, except for where does the rubber hit the road on policy? Like right now, we've got Bernie Sanders, the kind of the king of economic populism, out doing a tour. He's not giving up on climate change, which is not in any way Democrats letting people live their life. It's Washington saying you'll drive this car and you must buy this washing machine and you can't have this sort of appliance anymore. And you must get, all of these things, that we're all going to shut down oil and gas drilling. He's not giving up on that. Or, for instance, there are millions, tens of millions of working class union workers out there that want to keep their privately provided health care insurance, but Bernie Sanders wants to take it away and have Medicare for all. And again, I mean, so it sounds good. You do you, I'll do me. But I don't see the Democratic Party giving up on those giant policy ambitions that are fundamentally restructuring everybody's life in the vision of the world that they have.
Well, look, we will have political arguments about economic policy. Medicare for all, for instance, look, I mean, I'm in the camp, as you probably could guess, that, believes we have a parasitic, inefficient, terrible system. Some studies show it kills 60,000 people a year in the United States having the healthcare we have. The Canadian listeners on this show, this show are nodding their heads, yes. So we'll have a fight about that. Should there be private insurance? I don't know. I think not, but because it's wasteful and inefficient. And will there be some kind of transition to that takes a longer period of time than Bernie Sanders has proposed? Yeah, maybe there might be. Maybe there might be different carve-outs. Maybe there might be this and that. But that's a debate that we can have about single-payer healthcare. I do think it is different than the social issues, frankly. On climate change, is there a different way to implement climate change? I have long been an advocate of let's do the things that people don't see first. Let's deal with power generation in this country. When you flick on your light in your house, you don't know whether that power comes from sun, wind, coal, or oil, or whatever. It doesn't affect anybody's life, assuming that the price is reasonable, right? When you flick the light on in your house, you don't know where the power comes from. Just like the way we dealt with acid rain in this country. There was a big problem with acid rain in this country due to largely to power generation. We solved that problem. Does anybody today be like, oh no, we've got to go back and we'll live with acid rain because it was some great imposition? No. There are ways to do this, and I get that we get lost in the rhetoric of this, but I do think there is common ground among people of goodwill to deal with these problems. But it is not a position of goodwill to say that climate change is not a problem that does not need to be addressed. I mean, that's just not true.
Yeah, but the bottom line is you're saying is that on these big issues, the Democratic Party is still right to be out there telling everyone how they're going to live their life on policy issues.
Look, we live in a democracy. You go out there and you articulate a position. The voters can accept it or reject it. Too often these days, they're forced into a position where they're forced to pick a lesser of two evils, which I understand is unsatisfying for people. But yes, like the planet is warming. We need to figure out how to deal with that as not only a country but a world. So to say that that's not a problem, I think is irresponsible. But that's my political view. That's my moral view. You can have a different one, and we'll go to the ballot box. And we'll fight it out. That's all.
And we can argue about it on the Monk Debates podcast. But I want to move on to our third and final topic, which is the big T word. And I'm sitting here from Toronto, Canada, and people here they're scared because of this on-off directive from the Trump administration. No one knows what is coming tomorrow or the next day. So let's talk about tariffs. I think you both have very different views on whether this is good for the American economy. America first. Let's talk. How do tariffs actually benefit the middle and working class, as the Trump administration hopes to do? Jeff, let's start with you.
Well, look, I do think there is a role, and there has historically been a role for tariffs in order to prevent the deindustrialization of high wage countries. And that, we saw that in the free trade era in this country. We saw manufacturing fleeing around the world. It happens not to be a problem vis-a-vis Canada, frankly, or Europe, in my view, but it really an issue of high wage countries versus low wage countries. So is there a role for tariffs in protecting jobs in high wage countries? Yes. Is there a role for tariffs, frankly, in helping low wage, less developed countries to develop? I mean, if you look at the advanced industrial countries in this world, how many of them really developed in a free trade environment? England? Nope. United States? Nope. France? Nope. Almost nobody becomes an advanced industrial country in a free, I mean, there are a couple of exceptions, in a free trade environment. So the tariffs are good for many developing countries to protect their internal industries. So there is a role. Is what Trump doing rational, sane, economically smart? It's idiocy, and it only exposes the fact that this guy is, he's a block-headed autocratic idiot who really doesn't know what he's talking about. He wants to tax dairy imports from Canada. Well, we don't have any dairy imports from Canada, which is hilarious. He could make them 10,000,000% tariffs on dairy from Canada. It wouldn't affect anybody because we don't import any dairy from Canada, or almost none. I mean, the tariffs are on one day, they're off the next day. I get why the Canadians are frustrated. I grew up right on the border, 60 miles south of Montreal in Vermont, in an open border environment. We used to go back and forth. Gas was cheaper on one side one year, it was cheaper on the other side the next year. He would shop back and forth. So I think trade across borders is good. I think what Trump is doing is lunacy. But in the abstract, is there a role for tariffs in certain contexts? Yes.
Kim, the Wall Street Journal is pretty critical of tariffs. Do you share that view?
Well, I think I think there's a lot of different buckets here. I think one is the purpose. And look, when Donald Trump first came in, he was using them as a stick to get people to engage in some behavior that he wanted to see bettered. So, for instance, we saw the initial threats against Mexico and a few other countries if they weren't going to take some of these illegal immigrants back into their countries. They pretty quickly said they would. It looked as though that threat then went away.
Right. He's using it as a negotiation tactic.
What's that?
He was using it as a negotiating tactic.
Where it gets a lot dodgier is when Donald Trump, and this is new this time around in this administration, or at least the extent to which he's now talking about this. Donald Trump talks about tariffs are good in and of itself. As some amazing revenue generator and the way to make the economy hum. We do not really have any historical evidence for that. Tariffs, I mean, let's talk about the history of Smoot-Hawley. There are real problems. Look, and for the very reasons that Jeff actually lauds tariffs, is one of the reasons I have a problem with them. I'll give you a good example. Like, we have a sugar industry in the United States run by some very wealthy individuals. We can't compete with any number of countries around the world whose climates are better suited to be making sugar and in vast quantities. And so we do all of this stuff to protect this little industry, and which completely undermines the entire idea of trade, right? There are some countries that are better positioned to make some things than others. I mean, we have to buy rubber from outside this country. I mean, I guess we could turn all of Florida into a giant rubber producing farm, but to what benefit for anybody when we can buy it from people who make it more cheaply, and we send things to them that we do more cheaply or better. And for instance, a lot of the things that we have benefited on in recent years are in manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing, where we are the crown jewel of the world. That's what we want to be exporting.
But don't you want to make America less dependent on other economies for some of their most vital products? Like, why? Well, I've heard that, that's one of the reasons Trump is doing this. He wants to protect America against a potential supply chain crisis in the future.
Yeah, look, I think there's a legitimate conversation to have about that, rare earth minerals, et cetera, especially if part of that discussion is then aimed at making sure America is using its own resources. We have rare earth minerals in this country. We just haven't been allowed to use them because the left has locked up most of the land, and they protest against any mining projects. So I'm all for that. I think that there are certain reasons to be looking at national security questions. The worry is when that gets extended to everything. I mean, I think sugar is a good example. Is sugar really a national security worry? I don't know. But once you start that ball rolling, then you can use national security as a justification to protect almost any industry. Why are we not as productive as other people in the steel business, for instance? Because we have a very inefficient steel producing industry that is dominated by unions that ask for a lot of perks and privileges, and makes us uncompetitive next to other people. But the final problem is you get trade wars. And that's what we're looking at right now. I mean, we're just escalating. Well, the Europeans now have got a first tranche, second tranche. The Canadians have decided what they're going to tariff. And now Donald Trump has said, oh, really? You raised us 50%? I will raise you 50% more. That is the direction we are headed. And it's the question is when somebody is going to pull back and rationalize some of this.
Look, I mean, I think some of Kim's points are valid, but look, it is always true that you have a financial advantage, an economic advantage in production when you can pay people nothing. And the truth of the matter is much of this fight about tariffs, Trump's upset about drug companies in Ireland, companies in China making things that he's really not mad at the Chinese or at the Irish. These are American companies who have fled America to take advantage of either favorable tax rules or favorable wage rates or lax environmental standards in all these places. Really what's going on here is that Trump is trying to get these American, he's not saying it in this way, he's using jingoistic lingo, but really what he's trying to do is get American companies to bring their production back into the United States. Now, we let them go years ago, and it was a big mistake. And I think the Democrats who were engaged, who supported that now are looking back on it with a lot of remorse because we hollowed out America. But the tariffs can be a short-term effective tool to coerce those people to come back to where they should be.
Well, it already seems to have been working because there are companies that are coming back.
Yes.
Jeff just said something really important, except for I'd hone in on one part of it. Look, you want to send one of the greatest influxes of capital back to the United States happened in the wake of 2017 Trump tax cuts the first time around, because we changed our international taxation system so that we weren't penalizing companies for actually working in this country. Now, of course, Democrats would like to reverse a lot of that. They call it a giveaway to the rich. But my argument is, yes, I guess you can try to force this through tariffs, but there are many other policies that are far more effective at encouraging companies to come back to the United States than getting in a trade war with a lot of our partners around the world.
Well, we could abolish the minimum wage. We could get rid of environmental standards. We could end the corporate income tax. We could do all those things. I'm sure the Wall Street Journal's editorial page would be cheering, but that is not the kind of country that we want to live in.
Yeah, I don't think anybody is advocating for abolishing the minimum wage or getting rid of all environmental regulations. As I think when we have these nuanced discussions, it's more about these particular rules that are very bad for this economy, these particular demands in one sector from unions that are over the top. It's not about getting rid of everything. It's about having a rational discussion about some of the barriers to investment in the United States.
Now, I just have to give a 1 second shout out to my friends in the sugar world. It is true that a bunch of sugar
billionaires in the sugar
by some
world.
big companies in Florida, the Fanjoules and others. Half of sugar in America is made from sugar beets, which are grown by small farmers in places like North Dakota and Maine and other things. It's a very hard way of life. They produce an excellent product, which is indistinguishable in the bag from the product you get from Florida, from the sugar cane. And those folks do deserve support.
Okay, on that note, we're kind of hitting against our time today. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I've learned so much, and it's been so nice to have the two of you offer very different perspectives on some of the biggest issues making news today. So thank you, Kim. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us on the Monk Debates podcast.
Thanks, Ricki. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Thanks, as always. Yes.